Dr. Ahmed, I'm glad that we've managed to sort your line out. Thanks again for joining me this morning. You're the new Labour MP for Glasgow South West, and you seem unapologetic this morning, as you have every right to be, about the positives of immigration. Do you think it's quite hard to make that argument these days in British politics, though?
Well, thank you very much, Paul, for having me on this morning. And I think it's really important to think about the context in which we're having this conversation, first of all. And that is a context of unprecedented violence and naked racism on the streets of our country, which thankfully have been grappled well now by the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary. So in some ways, it's a kind of artificial synthesis to discuss immigration with that thuggery, because the two bear no resemblance, really.
Agreed.
I think all of us who are in political life would can have perfectly reasonable conversations around migration policy without linking it to somehow that it's acceptable to go out there and burn the car of a care worker who's done an 8-hour shift looking after the most vulnerable in society, or go and abuse Filipino nurses in the north of England. And so I think from that perspective, I think we have to decouple this conversation. And when I was asked my views about immigration in the health service, that is the context in which I was making that point. That, for instance, last week when I did a kidney transplant, I, a second-generation Pakistani, was the main surgeon. Across the table from me, there was someone from an Irish background. At the top end, the anaesthetist was a second-generation person from the Indian subcontinent. My scrub nurse was Bulgarian. And therefore, in the modern NHS, it is absolutely true that without those people there, we would not be able to function. And my reason for saying all of that was to say thank you to those people who have felt alienated and in some cases felt not accepted by this country despite the great contributions they were making. And my reason for highlighting that was to say, this is your country, you're welcome here, and without you, we could not function.
Do you worry, though, that the tendency in the government now will be to shift and have a knee-jerk reaction to what we've seen over the past 2 weeks? And I agree with your point, and I don't know if you were listening in the last hour, but we were talking about the difference actually between the rioters on the one hand, who, I would certainly, in my experience reporting on the ground, would categorise a fair few of them as belonging to the far right, a fair few of them as being people with a criminal record who just wanted to punch up with the police. So you've got that sort of small rump of people in the numbering, thankfully in the hundreds, who are turning up, and then the broader millions of people who peacefully are expressing their concern about the level of immigration in the country. Do you worry that there will be this kind of knee-jerk reaction in politics and from the Labour government to sort of shift too far to saying, right, quick, we must reduce immigration now, we can't talk about the benefits of it because we've had all this going on in the country?
No, not at all, because I think what you've seen already with the response to this behaviour over the last couple of weeks is a thoughtful, collegiate approach as how to manage this thuggery. And in the same way, whatever policy we need to discuss, there'll be a thoughtful, collegiate approach towards that too. And I would really emphasise that I do not couple the immigration debate with what's gone on in the last couple of weeks whatsoever, because what we've seen is people who have thought they've had licence to do things that any other walk of life or at any other time would be completely unacceptable and would be completely, rightly thought of as unacceptable to decent working class people in this country. That's the other thing that worries me about this conversation, is that we're somehow coupling the behaviour of these thugs, as you've said, who are sometimes far right, sometimes have criminal records, with decent working people in this country. And there's no connection between the two. And as far as migration policy is concerned, or policy around any other issue, it will be thoughtful and it will be collegiate. Because a lot of the issues that have come out of this last couple of weeks aren't really about immigration. They're more about people who feel alienated from power, who feel alienated from the speed of life and a lack of opportunity. And that's one of the things that I would hope as a parliamentarian I can inform and improve over the next 4 to 5 years.
There were some interesting comments as well by the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, this week, saying that NHS staff could refuse treatment to people who are racist towards them. I just wonder, Dr. Ahmed, whether you've experienced racism in the NHS and whether you would refuse treatment to someone who was expressing racism.
So what Wes was saying, he is my boss, I'm his PPS. So what he was saying is essentially underlining a long-term policy that the health service has against any kind of abusive behaviour, that we don't tolerate it. We have a zero-tolerance policy, and in that context, the staff member that's the recipient of that abuse has an absolute right to not treat that patient. So in that sense, there's no shift in policy. From my own personal perspective, luckily, touch wood, it's been a long time since I've felt overt racist abuse in my career. It did happen a couple of times when I was a much junior doctor, and I must say, at the time, I just brushed it. I brushed it off because I had the overwhelming support of my colleagues around me, and even other patients that heard it were equally disgusted. I suppose what I've been triggered more by is in recent times when I've heard, things like the P word spoken nakedly and overtly and aggressively on the street. That used to happen when I was growing up in the 80s. I thought we were past that time, and I was a little bit kind of sad and triggered to hear those words so kind of openly expressed again on the streets of Britain.
Why do you think, you say the streets of Britain there, it was actually the streets of England really, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Why do you think we haven't seen
Northern
the same...
Ireland.
True, very true. Northern Ireland as well. Of course, Northern Ireland has a strong history, particularly in the past few decades, of unrest. Scotland, we haven't seen riots. Do you think there is a difference between Scotland and England in the way that this issue is approached?
Overall, I think the symptoms of this problem exist in every part of the country. Obviously, I'm very thankful that didn't translate into mass kind of rioting in Scotland. But don't get me wrong, the people that I represent in southwest Glasgow, it's one of the most diverse communities in Scotland. I think I'm right in saying it's probably the most populous Muslim Southeast Asian constituency in Scotland. It has 5 mosques, it has gurdwaras, it has churches. The feelings here have been of anxiety have been just as palpable, thankfully not translated into anything more serious. And so we're spending a lot of time in communities trying to, engage with them, with the police, to make sure that the requisite, security arrangements are in place. So I think we can't be complacent wherever we are in the country. The scourge of racism is unfortunately always there. Whenever we think we've defeated it, is probably the time that we need to be thinking again. Progress, as we've seen over the last 25, 30 years, is not linear. We can go backwards if we're not careful. And fundamentally, I think, however you discuss this issue, whether you say people are upset about a certain religion or migration, what we've seen in the streets the last couple of weeks is just people who have wanted to attack other people based on the colour of their skin, because they weren't going after that BMW that we saw in the video because they thought that they were from a certain country or from a certain religion. They just went after them because they were of a different colour. And I think that should be a wake-up call that we still have a lot of work to do in this country in the sphere of racism.
And just lastly, we were talking in the last hour about the influence of social media as well.
Yeah.
Do you hold Elon Musk responsible partly for what we've seen over the past 2 weeks?
I think anyone using social media platforms, particularly X, as parliamentarians, politicians, or people with a significant public following, and that includes me, needs to reflect on if that is a public good or not anymore. Because I think what we've seen over the last couple of weeks, but also punctuated over the last, I would say, 8 or 9 years, is that I think some people think it's a free hit, what you say or what you do in social media. It doesn't really resemble real life. And quite consequentially, we have seen that is not true, and that your behaviour, on social media is just the same as it would be out in the streets. And I think for some people, there needs to be a reminder of that, and moreover, for social media platforms, there needs to be a reminder of their responsibility in maintaining public order and whether they are conducive to the public good. And I think all of us as parliamentarians are having reflections as to whether our continued presence in these spaces is conducive to the public good.
So what do you think about leaving then, potentially? Are you thinking about leaving X?
Well, what I'm certainly not going to be doing anymore is engaging in any kind of political debate, and certainly not any nuanced political debate on that kind of platform, because I don't think it goes anywhere. And I've kind of, at the moment, personally taken the decision that I'm going to use it simply as a notice board for, constituents, for fellow parliamentarians to know what I'm doing, what my surgeries are, what activities I'm up to. But I find it difficult now to see that as a space where we can have any meaningful, deep discussions.
Interesting. Dr. Ahmed, thank you. Really interesting to speak to you this morning. Always great to have new MPs on the show as well, and to give our listeners a flavour of some of the new parliamentarians in this very changed parliament that we now have in Westminster. Thank you for your time this morning. That was Dr. Zubir Ahmed. He is the new Labour MP for Glasgow South West, also an NHS surgeon. So really interesting to get his views on the benefits, in his view, that immigration has for the country.